Thank you everyone for staying on. This is our final panel session today. So I thank everyone who's been on since the beginning of today. And this session is Case Studies from the Field, Disrupting the Standards with Dr. Rast, Dr. Amber Wiley, Dr. Kristen Hayashi, and Dr. Kathy Gudis, with the moderator, Hannah Cameron, who is a doctoral student here at University of Maryland. And so without further ado, I hand it over to Hannah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. And as Michelle said, thank you for staying on all day if you have. This is the final session for this evening, Case Studies from the Field, Disrupting the Standards. And similar to the other sessions, we have 3 presentations by our panelists this evening, followed by a Q&A. And throughout the presentations, if you have questions you want to pose, we will address them at the end, but you can add them to the Q&A if you'd like. I will briefly introduce each panelist, and then we will begin the presentations. So our first panelist is Dr. Rast, who is an associate professor of history at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, and serves as a board member for Latinos and Heritage Conservation and for the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation. He also served as the primary consultant on the Cesar Chavez Special Resource Study in 2012, and as a result, produced several National Historic Landmark and National Register nominations. Dr. Rast's presentation is titled The Case for Criterion P, Politics, Perseverance, and Purpose in Historic Preservation, which discusses his work with the National Park Service and Latino and Latina community members in San Jose, California. Our second panelist is Dr. Amber Wiley, who will be presenting Reevaluating Core Values. Dr. Wiley is an assistant professor of art history at Rutgers University. Her research interests center on the social aspects of design and how it affects urban communities. Her publications focus on African-American cultural heritage, urbanism in New Orleans, school design, urban renewal, and preservation. And lastly, our final panelists are Dr. Kristen Hayashi and Dr. Kathy Gudis, who will be presenting Tokio Florist, Critical Cartographies of Race and Place. Dr. Hayashi is Director of Collections Management and Access and Curator of the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. She also serves on the Board of Directors for Little Tokyo Historical Society and Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. Dr. Gudis is an Associate Professor of History and Director of Public History Program at the University of California, Riverside. And she has worked for over 20 years with art and history museums in historic preservation and on multi-platform place-based projects that focus on Southern California. And with that, we will begin our first presentation with Dr. Rast. Panelists, we will be keeping time and provide a 5-minute warning.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. And good afternoon, everyone. From Spokane, Washington, and from my office at Gonzaga University, which resides on the ancestral homelands of the Spokane tribe of Indians. I want to start with a quick thanks to Michelle for organizing this amazing and inspiring symposium. Thanks to everyone who's been helping her behind the scenes. Thanks to my fellow panelists, and thanks to everyone who's joining in today and tomorrow. So I began working with the National Park Service to identify and protect sites and properties associated with Cesar Chavez and the farm worker movement in 2002. This work expanded significantly after Congress authorized the Cesar Chavez Special Resource Study in 2008, and it culminated 4 years later in 2012 when President Obama established the Chavez National Monument near Bakersfield, California. The Special Resource Study itself recommended that Congress create a 5-unit National Historical Park, and since 2012, I've continued to work on the protection and interpretation of one of those 5 potential units, the former Our Lady of Guadalupe Mission Chapel in East San Jose, California, which I'll come back to in a minute. From 2010 to 2012, I also served on the National Park System Advisory Board's Planning Committee. Our collective task was to outline a vision for a new master plan for the National Park System, and many of us focused on issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Based on my experiences with the Chavez Special Resource Study and my familiarity with the work of Ned Kaufman and others, I identified the Park Service's integrity standards as a significant barrier to diversity in its designation programs. I also surveyed prior efforts to increase diversity and inclusion in these programs, including a push associated with African American history in the 1970s, California's 5 Views projects during the 1980s, and efforts associated with women's history and with the Underground Railroad during the 1990s. As I explained in a committee report, these initiatives faced resistance and other challenges that limited their accomplishments. Park Service historian John Sprinkle is familiar with these kinds of efforts. In his 2014 book, Crafting Preservation Criteria, Sprinkle mentions Criterion P, which he defines as the recognition that, quote, persons with political influence or fiscal power shape discussions about which historic places deserve conservation. Sprinkle cites the work of a historian who captured Park Service complaints about properties that were designated largely because someone with influence wanted it to happen. The same historian lamented those diversity initiatives because he thought they too reflected the power of Criterion P. They were politicized. Or maybe they weren't politicized enough. With the rest of my time, I want to focus on the difficult but successful effort to designate Guadalupe Mission Chapel as a National Historic Landmark. One of the lessons I learned from that effort is that sometimes we need more than a strong nomination. Sometimes we need to contend with Criterion P. Whether we lament that reality, embrace it, or just draw inspiration from it remains something of an open question. So the Chavez Special Resource Study recognized Guadalupe Mission Chapel's national historical significance. Consecrated in 1953, this chapel was the first house of worship and multi-purpose meeting space for ethnic Mexican Catholics in East San Jose. It's also where Chavez came to know his 2 mentors. While Father Donald McDonald taught him about labor history and Catholic social doctrine, ideas of social justice, Fred Rast trained him as an organizer through the CSO, a predominantly Mexican-American civil rights organization that found a home in the chapel. Chavez led the CSO at the national level before co-founding what became the UFW. As I documented this history, I got to know Chavez family members and other community members in East San Jose. After my work with the Special Resource Study was completed, Santa Clara County hired me to work with these community members in preparing an NHL nomination for the former chapel building. Interior Secretary Ken Salazar had launched the Park Service's American Latino Heritage Initiative, saying that he hoped it would generate 100 new NHL nominations. President Obama had by this point established the Chavez National Monument, and the Special Resource Study was, as I said, recommending the inclusion of the former chapel building in a National Historical Park. So we had many reasons for optimism when we submitted our letter of inquiry to the NHL program in January of 2013. NHL program officials told us their review would take 4 months. In May of 2014, 15 months later, they finally notified us that they thought the building lacked sufficient integrity. Now, as we had acknowledged in our letter, the building had been moved 150 yards north in the 1970s and converted into a parish hall named after Father McDonald. The bell tower and stained glass windows were removed, the eaves were extended, and the interior was remodeled. Other than the move, none of these changes were completely irreversible, but program officials decided they would not accept our nomination, let alone support it. So over the next 2 years, we regrouped and strategized. Among other things, we developed counter-arguments, some specific to the building, and others that questioned the Park Service's emphasis on integrity more broadly. I'll share 3 quick examples. First, our research suggested that the building's character-defining features were not the bell tower and stained glass windows, but rather the walls and the roof, which had created a humble building and a significant gathering space, and these features were fully intact. Second, because program officials explained that integrity assessments often boil down to whether someone who only knew the building during the period of significance would recognize the building today, we found former community members who affirmed such recognition. And third, when officials defended the program's integrity standards by asserting that the program, quote, has no site associated with Benjamin Franklin because no site exists which possesses the high degree of historic integrity required, we counted 5 National Historic Landmarks associated with Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia, including Independence Hall. And we wondered how they did not know about these. We also continued to mobilize support. The mayor of San Jose commissioned a historic structure report to guide potential restoration work on the building. The community state assembly members secured California Historical Landmark designation, and the diocese weighed the value of a separate National Register nomination. We conferred with members of California's congressional delegation and with stakeholders such as Dolores Huerta, LULAC, and the California Catholic Conference. By this point, broader conversations about the Park Service's designation programs and standards were taking place, many of them informed by the Park Service's American Latino Heritage Initiative, Women's History Initiative, AAPI Heritage Initiative, and LGBTQ Heritage Initiative. For me, these efforts converged. The former chapel building offered a vehicle for rethinking integrity standards, and community members wanted to take full advantage. Some wanted to deliver our nomination directly to Interior Secretary Sally Jewell, but most still wanted to work with the Park Service and to see the agency improve its processes. Those prospects looked grim when the Latino Heritage Initiative scholars advocated for the building, and NHL program officials noted in their response that 2 pre-existing landmarks associated with Chavez were plenty, quote unquote. This despite the program's support for the 19th landmark associated with 19th century architect H.H. Richardson about a year later. Our effort became a bit more challenging for me personally when an NHL program official sent a "just between us" message to a mutual colleague, falsely accusing me of fabricating evidence. I received a copy of that message, but community members asked me not to seek recourse until after our effort was concluded. And by that point, this person had left the Park Service. Fortunately, changes in leadership on the NPS Advisory Board and its Landmarks Committee and the ongoing impact of those broader conversations brought new possibilities. We still wanted to present our case to the Landmarks Committee. We finally received that opportunity in October 2016, and the committee recommended approval to Secretary Jewell. So ultimately, this was a success story. We had a strong nomination, but we also organized and we called on allies, as Chavez himself literally taught these community members to do. We had passion, but we were patient. We persevered. Now, I'm not saying this effort succeeded because of political influence. The mayor of the 10th largest city in the US lobbied NHL program officials on our behalf in person in DC. We secured support from California's congressional delegation, from the California State Legislature, from the California SHPO, from local leaders, stakeholder organizations, prominent scholars, and many others. And none of that seemed to sway program officials. John Sprinkle suggests that Criterion P has worked for many people over the decades, but it was not working for us. Sprinkle actually describes Criterion P as a, quote, defining characteristic of historic preservation, but it started to strike me as some sort of secret menu item. It's good, but you have to know about it, and you have to know how to get it. This might make it something to embrace, but I am open to counter arguments that we shouldn't have one set of rules for those who have political influence and another for those who do not, that we shouldn't exert political pressure on a process managed by professionals, that we really shouldn't do anything that would politicize or further politicize preservation in general or the Park Service in particular. And yet many of us would say that everything is already political. After the events of the past 4 years, who can question that? And don't calls to rise above politics usually come from people who have the luxury of doing so. As a professor, as a scholar, and as a local landmarks commission member myself, I make professional judgments all the time, so I understand the appeal of calls for objectivity, impartiality, and deference to expertise. But as a Mexican American, as a Catholic, and as a generally decent human being, I believe that equity and justice are absolutely vital. So if being apolitical helps us achieve equity and justice, then let's be apolitical. But when being political helps us achieve equity and justice, I think we need to be political. Or maybe there's room for compromise. Instead of criterion P, we could embrace a criterion E for equity or a criterion J for justice. And we could encourage our local commission members, SHPOs, and Park Service colleagues to do the same. Or criterion P could stand for passion or for perseverance, both of which sustained our effort in East San Jose, and both of which sprang from our deep sense of purpose. We understood that our preservation effort was not about an old building that once had a bell tower. Our effort was about people, their past, their present, and their future. Thanks, everyone. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Rast. And up next, we have Dr. Wiley presenting Reevaluating Core Values.
All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And here we go. So the title of my talk is indeed Reevaluating Core Values, because I didn't actually know what I was going to talk about when I agreed to present this afternoon or this evening. So I've refined it a bit from my initial acceptance of the offer to speak. And saying that, I'd also like to acknowledge the organizers of this event. And quite frankly, I know y'all have been going all day long because I've had you on my phone the whole time too. And so thank you for your perseverance and for your energy in bringing us all together. I have to say that the subtitle of the talk is called American Ideals in Focus, because I'll be talking specifically about a case study that I was working on for the better half of 2 years, or the better part of 2 years, up until about 2020, March 2020. And it really has to do with American ideals and those ideals that we hold so dear, that we claim to. I've been talking a lot over the past several months in regards to equity and diversity and inclusion and decolonization and all these things, especially after the advent of the, I don't even know which wave of the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer, after the killings of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And I've been thinking about this question of how long have I been doing this work? And the work always doesn't look the same. It changes depending on our moods and attitudes and what the new phrase is. And so I really did go all the way back to '88. My aunt took my brother and cousins and myself out on the campaign trail. She had us canvassing for Jesse Jackson. She brought the young kids along with her as she knocked door to door, supporting his bid in the primaries for the '88 election. And so from that point on, we've been in this mode of operation, specifically in my family, thinking about a rainbow coalition, issues of diversity and inclusion. And so it's been that long. So many of us on these panels and throughout the day have been engaged in this work from the time that it was called multiculturalism and inclusion and diversity, and moving on to issues of equity and social justice and decolonization and anti-racism, right? But we've been doing the work. And I think it's been really amazing throughout the day just to hear from folks who are like, I've been doing this for 10 years, I've been doing this for 15 years, I've been doing this for 20 years, because the knowledge is in the room. It's in our virtual room. The expertise is here. And this is where we need to be. And we are the ones who should be moving this conversation forward in the ways that folks are talking about. So I just wanted to put that out there first and foremost, is to say that in my biography, I think it says I've been doing this work for 10 years. And I'm like, well, you know what? Actually, that's not true. We've been doing this work for much longer. And we'll be continuing to do the work in the future. So my particular case study that I want to talk about today is the Carter G. Woodson National Historic Site. I was honored, quite frankly, to be hired along with my co-PI, Maria McCurder, to do an update for the National Historic Landmark nomination form. That form was filled out in the 1970s, and we were hired by the Association for the Study of African American Life and History via the National Park Service to do this update. The update was important, and this is about 2018. The update was important because the Woodson House had undergone a series of renovation stabilization efforts. And also there was going to be an expansion of the site to include a museum about Carter G. Woodson. So what ASALH wanted and what the Park Service wanted was a nomination draft that included the amount of work that had been done on the site so that all of that information could be in one place. Additionally, an expanded social history of Carter G. Woodson's life. So this is just an image of Woodson at home in his library. His home was in Washington, D.C. on 9th Street in the historic Shaw neighborhood. Out of his home, it was an office, it was a library, it was an archive. It was also a production space for the production of books and bulletins and newspaper articles. You can see on the left the image of the Associated Publishers, which is a company that Woodson founded to produce materials on Black history. And so we know Carter G. Woodson as the father of Black history, but I've been thinking about him more recently, and he was not just the father of Black history, he was the father of public history, right? Because he saw Black history, American history, as something that didn't need to just be circulating in the academic books that he was producing from Associated Publishers, right? He had books, he had academic journals, the Journal of Negro History that was also being published out of his home, as well as the Negro History Bulletin, which had a much wider circulation and a more broad audience besides or apart from the academic audience. So for thinking about his efforts that started in Negro History Week, right, in the 1920s, public history in schools and churches, circulating these pamphlets and bulletins with information, that truly is the start of our public history movement in the US. And we really haven't talked about him that way, but I think we should. So the National Historic Site, or the National Historic Landmark of the Carter G. Woodson House, was actually proposed on the at the beginning of the bicentennial era in 1976. So when Ray was talking, I just kept nodding my head and going, and I was on video, so I had to turn off the video because some of the things that he was saying directly relate to this particular situation. He said in the 1970s, there were folks who were trying to put forward Black National Historic Landmarks, and that is indeed the case. There was a company that was founded in the late 1960s called the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation. It was founded by two brothers, Robert Vincent DeForest and a third person, Terry Troy. Vincent DeForest was a trained architect. He had relationships with the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He had worked at the AME Church as an AME architect in their organization. And he came to DC ahead of the Poor People's Campaign. And so he was very much involved in the civil rights of the time. So he and his brother formed this organization because they wanted the bicentennial to be a vehicle for improving the lives of Black folks. That was part of their mission statement. And so they actually got connected to the National Park Service through ASALH, through the organization that Carter G. Woodson founded, because the Park Service had approached ASALH to say, do you have anybody within your organization who could do the Black history stuff to nominate some more National Historic Landmarks, because we've been getting pressure as the bicentennial is coming up that we don't have enough. In the early 1970s, there were 3 sites of all the National Historic Landmarks that could have been directly associated or nominated under Black history, right? That was Frederick Douglass. That house had already been a part of the national park system for quite some time. Booker T. Washington's home and George Washington Carver. Those were the three. So what ABC did, Afro-American Bicentennial, is that they entered into a contract with the National Park Service, an initial 3-year contract where they would survey sites all across the US to recommend for inclusion for National Historic Landmarks. That was their work. And Ray also talked about Criterion P, right? Politics. ABC had that in their pocket, especially after Home Rule in DC, because they had Walter Fauntroy as one of their allies in making the case for the National Historic Landmarks that they want to nominate. You see Vincent DeForest here talking to both Walter Fauntroy, the non-voting congressman in DC, as well as Senator Ed Brooke of Massachusetts, but originally from DC, right? And one of the things that ABC claimed to do is to continue the revolution, talking about bicentennial revolutions, right? Continue the revolution through the process of decolonization, a movement towards self-realization and self-government by people determined not to be kept in subject status. So they're talking about historic preservation, but they're also talking about justice and equity, the things that we're talking about here today. There we go. So here is an image of the Carter G. Woodson site in the 1970s as it was captured by Habs, and the site is right here. It was owned by Asala during the time period. They didn't have the money needed to do the repairs. They eventually moved out. It was the Asala headquarters. I keep getting the. Here's some of the restoration work that was happening in the late teens for renovating, stabilizing, and doing the work of restoration for the site to become a historic home museum. So just some images before and afters. And the updated information is part of what I was capturing in my work. Another part of this, the work of updating this nomination. So the nomination went through in 1976, actually, right? Highly symbolic. My job was to create additional narrative of the life and work of Carter G. Woodson beyond what was written about him in 76. So here you see a variety of Park Service, historic structure reports, interpretation reports, things that they wanted to do, but hadn't quite gotten to the point of doing them prior to all the renovations. I neglected to say that the Carter G. Woodson site actually became a unit of the National Park Service in 2003. So it was no longer owned by Asala, but again, a National Park Service unit. So that's another reason why so much was expended upon this particular site. So my job in updating the nomination meant that I had to reevaluate it in present day Criterion. So looking at the themes that we had in the National Historic Landmarks program, including it within the Civil Rights in America framework. So we've heard a lot about theme studies for National Historic Landmarks. And so my job is to bring it up to code, to 2020 code, so to speak, in terms of our various ways that we talk about the site, to capture the changing of the neighborhood, right? From the time that Carter G. Woodson purchased the site in 1922 to present day. And so in that work, we expanded, Maria McCurder and I expanded the nomination form from 10 pages, which is not unusual for this time period, to 83. Just a little bit more information, just a little bit. We corrected the period of significance. It initially said 1915 to 1922, to 1950. But the Association for the Study of African American Life and History was founded in 1915, but not in Washington, D.C., actually in Chicago. And so we changed the period of significance to the time when Carter G. Woodson actually occupied this home and ran the association through there. We put in all the themes that we believe the house signified. So civil rights themes, social institutions and movements, expressing cultural values, shaping the political landscape. All of this was deemed appropriate in terms of the research that we found. This is when things began to get sticky. We updated the criterion under which we wanted to update the nomination. Criterion 2 as a site that was affiliated with an important person. This is the primary site from which Carter G. Woodson worked, right? We did the compare and contrast. No other site embodied his work more than this site. But Criterion 3 is what got us stuck. We wanted to argue that the Carter G. Woodson National Historic Site really was a symbol of a great ideal of the American people. Someone tell me how much time I have left because I forgot to run my. Am I good?
We got started a little late, but 5 minutes.
5 minutes, I can do this. Thank you very much, because normally I run my timer and I didn't do that today. So the great ideal of American people. The person who was responsible for us putting forward this criterion was actually Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, the president of ASALH. She was deeply concerned about this nomination update, and she wanted to make sure that it captured everything that was intrinsic to the site. And so I went about finding different examples of sites that had intrinsic values related to Criterion 3. I found 3. The Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma, Alabama, Freedom Tower, that was a more recent nomination. And within the National Register, the National Historic Landmark Bulletin, they say maybe the Liberty Bell is the kind of site that actually holds intrinsic ideals of the American people. I mean, I was in the weeds here, going through all the information I could find. One thing that was really important is that in relationship to Criterion 3, most of the Park Service people say, well, this was rarely used. We rarely use this, right? If you can nominate a site under any other criterion, then you don't need Criterion 3. It's an issue of expediency. But for us, it was an issue of putting Woodson into the same conversation, or really saying that what his work was actually an enduring ideal of the American people, giving humanity back to Black Americans, talking about the issues of the lost cause narrative that was being propagated throughout the US. And so that's really part and parcel of his work. Carter G. Woodson referred to his research and to his outreach as a movement. He trained an enormous amount of historians, who then trained other historians, who trained more historians who were part of his lineage. And he was considered a scholar activist, right? And so even in his work, he talks about the fact that, you know, you can't talk about Abraham Lincoln without talking about the 178,000 Negroes who had been mustered into the service of the Union, and who by their heroism demonstrated that they were entitled to freedom and citizenship. Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton in 2003, talking about why Carter G. Woodson's site was indeed worthy of being recognized as a National Historic Site. She said his influence in understanding American history and historiography helped bring changes in American attitudes concerning Black people, and ultimately changes in the legal status of African Americans in our country. There's tons of research that supports this notion that the kind of work that Woodson did truly built the foundation and the platform for the civil rights liberties and the fights and the battles and the legal battles that happened that came after him. Our own particular issue is that while trying to propose this criterion to the Park Service, we got a lot of pushback. They really didn't want to use it. And it, you know, really makes me think about, especially in 2021, if we have the criterion and it's talking about American ideals, what are our American ideals, and when are we going to say what those are exactly? So it really, I think it's something that we need to come to terms with as a country. And I really think it is something that we need to come to terms with in terms of historic preservation as well. So that is my time. I thank you, and I cede the mic.
Thank you, Dr. Wiley. We will move to our final presentation with Dr. Christian Hayashi and Dr. Kathy Gudis. And I will also just do a quick reminder, if you have questions, please go ahead and add them to the Q&A, and we will address them after the third presentation.
Okay, let's see. Okay, greetings everyone. I'm Kristen Hayashi, and I'm co-presenting today with Catherine Gudis. We've entitled our presentation Tokio Florist, Critical Cartographies of Race and Place. I'll start off by providing some background on this project, which started in 2018 and continues today. I'll share a little bit of the history and talk about our efforts to obtain a local historic cultural monument designation, and then I'll turn it over to Kathy. So the story of Tokio Florist, a longtime Japanese-American owned and operated cut flower business in Los Angeles, as well as efforts to preserve the site, form the basis for a case study from the field that disrupts the standards in a variety of ways. In 2019, the Los Angeles City Council designated the Sakai Kozawa residence / Tokio Florist and pole sign as Historic Cultural Monument number 1198. It became only the 9th historic cultural monument within the city to outwardly represent the Japanese American experience, and one of just a few that reflects the contributions of women of color to the region. Through the research that was involved in compiling the nomination that Catherine Gudis, our colleague Rosalind Sagara, and I co-wrote on behalf of the Little Tokyo Historical Society, we contributed to a multifaceted approach to preserving the history of the Sakai Kozawa family and their business. What we realized throughout our process and from the work of other colleagues is that preservation of the site enables us to reckon with long histories of racism and restrictions on citizenship, land use, and ownership, as well as to engage in a critical cartography that reinscribes the contributions of Japanese Americans and women onto the landscape of Los Angeles. The story of Tokio Florist began in 1929 when recently widowed Yuki Kawakami Sakai, with 5 young children to support, opened a flower shop on Los Feliz Boulevard in Los Angeles, which she called Tokio Florist. It was one of many flower farms, stands, and nurseries operated by Japanese immigrants that once dominated the landscape of northeastern Los Angeles' Los Feliz and Atwater neighborhoods. Successfully operating Tokio Florist came against great odds. Barred from naturalization and denied the rights of citizens, Japanese immigrants like Yuki had to be creative to find ways around discriminatory legislation, such as the Alien Land Law, which in California placed stringent restrictions on land use as well as ownership. Although Tokio Florist opened just ahead of the Depression, it managed to gain steady business. Surely, though, pressures were exacerbated by Yuki's status as a single woman with children. Yet Tokio Florist kept company with many other Japanese established flower farms and stands in the area. Every member of the Sakai family helped with daily operations, cultivating poinsettias, carnations, gladiolas, and ranunculus, keeping the store open 7 days a week. Soon, though, the forced removal and incarceration of West Coast residents of Japanese descent during World War II meant that the Sakai family, along with many other Japanese Angelenos, had to quickly settle their business and personal affairs. The Sakai stored many of their belongings at the family's flower ranch in the San Fernando Valley and made an agreement with a neighbor to take care of Tokio Florist in Los Feliz for the duration of the war. Following the Sakai's return from Manzanar, it took several years before the family was able to revive the flower shop. In 1960, Tokio Florist and other small businesses around it faced another obstacle. They were displaced as apartment towers began to spring up on Los Feliz Boulevard. The changing real estate market held greater value for residential development than flower cultivation. Additionally, many mom and pop flower shops were forced out of business over the next couple of decades as supermarkets and corporate chains began to dominate the market. It was the beginning of the end of the Japanese American flower farms and stands that once dotted the area, but not for Tokio Florist, which would reopen less than a mile away at 2718 Hyperion Avenue in Silver Lake. This begins the period of significance for the nomination that we wrote. At their new location, Yuki Sakai, along with her daughter Sumi Kozawa and son-in-law Frank Kozawa, recreated certain aspects of their previous shop. They constructed a greenhouse, converted a garage into a workshop, and reinstalled a large workbench and other equipment under the porte cochere and the porch of their new home, a stately 1911 Tudor craftsman, to support the operations of Tokio Florist. The loyal customers who had frequented the flower shop for decades allowed Tokio Florist to flourish in this new location. Customers enjoyed wandering throughout the property, taking in the planted flowers, the creation of floral arrangements in Sumi's workshop, as well as the Japanese garden that Frank and Sumi designed. The expanse of land at the rear of the property was used to grow Iceland poppies, sweet peas, and seasonal flowers. Every open space in the front and back of the property was used for the business. Ultimately, this multi-generational, female-headed family business thrived until 2006, when Sumi retired. It's really remarkable that despite all the challenges that Yuki, Sumi, and Frank sustained, the business continued for over 80 years. With this rich history, the HCM nomination received great support. Yet, our advocacy efforts were really tested a few months later when the new owner revealed plans to remove nearly all of the material touchstones on the property that reflected the history and legacy of Tokio Florist and the Sakai Kozawa family. Together, Catherine, Rosalind, and I represented the Little Tokyo Historical Society to oppose the proposed plans. Staff from the City of Los Angeles' Office of Historic Resources, members of the Los Angeles Cultural Heritage Commission, and staff from the local council member's office were very supportive of preserving the cultural significance of the site. The Cultural Heritage Commission created a committee to ensure that the approach to the site took into consideration the wishes of its many stakeholders. Yet, significant challenges remained. How could we convince the new owner to go to great expense and effort to preserve unpermitted structures made of somewhat ephemeral materials? We highly value these additions that the family made, but we also recognize the inherent challenges that include, which you see here, violation of fire code and the cost involved in shoring up these structures. Nevertheless, we advocated for the significance of the vernacular style structures that reflect the Sakai Kozawa family and Tokio Florist, and we remained critical of design iterations that would result in erasure of the Japanese American historical layer. Moving forward with the owner's plans would leave behind only the craftsman Tudor style home, exclusively highlighting the Anglo past, which dates back to the 1920s, when Dr. Harrison Brigham, his wife Eunice, and their live-in servant Belula Harper resided there. Today, plans for the site remain unresolved. We're still hopeful, though, for a hybrid approach to preservation. And while the future of these structures is unknown, there have been a number of ongoing projects intended to preserve the memory of Tokio Florist and the Sakai Kozawa family. So now I'll turn it over to Catherine Gudis to elaborate further.
Thank you. As Kristen said, as with the other steps in the process of landmarking the property, there was an outpouring of community response and support when we returned to the Cultural Heritage Commission to address the potential demolition of the structures that were by the hand of the Sakai Kozawas. Now, these images are showing those threatened aspects of the property, as well as the archival animation of those spaces, the people, the family, and the ways in which the property changed over time, which I want to address in different ways right now. Now, the designation of the property as a City of LA Historic Cultural Monument is incredibly important. It addresses erasures and silences in the dominant record. It revises those selective traditions of landmark nominations that have long emphasized architectural connoisseurship and celebrated white elite, and especially men. That's why restoring just the Tudor craftsman house without the material signs of multi-generational family labor by the Sakai Kozawas and the others who worked with them is so problematic. Yet, what this case study also suggests is the necessity to demonumentalize preservation, to revise the emphasis on her heroism and singular individuals as drivers of historical change, and refuse the faulty focus on the spectacle of events. What about the lives lived in spaces of impossibility, precarity, and the grind of daily, lifelong labor? This is typically invisible, distinctly not monumental. Perhaps that's why labor and laboring landscapes, intersectionality, and nuanced racial representation seem so scantily attended to in the city's Survey LA in its various context statements. Sure, in terms of labor, leaders of industry and their buildings are commemorated, but not usually the multiple groups of laborers on whose backs the industry was built, the places where they lived or the fields where they grew and picked flowers and crops. So instead of preservation as an endpoint, let's engage it as a continuum, marking, as Paul Farber and Ken Lum of Monument Lab write, a site of struggle, but also of possibility, and as part of a broader reckoning with how the body politic operates and how we can live with one another. This case study gives us some opportunities to do that. Susie Kozawa, the granddaughter of Tokio Florist founder Yuki Sakai and a sound artist based in Seattle, you see her at the right, took on legacy building as a means of continuing a preservation process, and both processing the past for herself and creating something anew. And she described it as a three-part process: documentation, dissemination, and creative reuse. Now, the three blur together, and the third is ongoing, hopefully indefinitely. For phase one, she invited different artists to do their own documentation: filmmakers Giovanni Jantz, artist Yuka Murakami, a still from her image, the Tokio story featured here, architect, artist Peter Tolkien, and documentarian Ann Kaneko were among those who joined Susie on site. This film of Tokyo Story was screened at the Japanese American National Museum and other arts venues, and showed both the moment in time before the house was sold and the memory of things past. This film, which was by Giovanni Jantz, is called On a Visit to Tokio Florist, and another element of the ways in which this ongoing preservation and creative reuse can continue. This sprang from interviews that Sojin Kim did with Giovanni Jantz, and then later filming that they did on site. It started on Valentine's Day in 1999, and it ended Valentine's Day in 2019. Now, this is an image of Sumi as part of the interviews. The film proceeds, and we can sort of journey through the property along with Frank Kozawa as he collects poppies from the flower beds in the upper terraces behind the property. We see him carrying them down and into the shop, giving them to Sumi's sister Rose to collect and to create displays, as you see at right. So the film is documenting the process or the ways in which the entire property was utilized, but with the interjection of Susie's work as a sound artist, we start to see something else, and it's a palimpsest. It's a palimpsest that allows us to see or to feel the layers of time in the life of the family and the property. And it's also about ephemeral practices, the way that a sound artist can draw our attention to deep listening to what the land itself sounds like, and to draw attention to those layers of time and the spirit and animation of the land. So throughout the film, we see different moments in time juxtaposed against Susie playing the house and the grounds itself, from found instruments, from artifacts, from the property and the business itself, as she charts the different ways in which the house and the property shift forms. She describes old buildings as amplifiers and as resonators. And so she's offering a way in which memory and soundscape come together. So she plays the house, right? And she calls upon us to listen as deeply as she does, as she records a historical soundscape soundscape and score that changed as the contents and animation of the house and property also shifted. So this joins the documentary and interpretive record, a creative reuse, if you will. In addition, as thousands of cherished items, each with a story, were being tagged and sorted and put up for this estate sale, Susie led tour after tour through each object and through the rooms roped off from viewers, where she laboriously sorted through history, dividing that of historical value from commodity, as if that's easy. She also somehow managed to turn this estate sale into a commemorative act. As people visited over the course of several weekends in late November of 2018, she circulated through the crowd like a hostess at her own party or that of her folks, microphone in hand, recording the stories of Tokio Florist and connections to the neighborhood, whether they were family friends of Sumi's or longtime customers. She wished each artifact a long life and its new owner the happiness she'd experienced with it. Here, she's recording the stories of the photos, and she in turn is being recorded by a radio producer, Brigitte Kelly, who followed her from 2018 all the way up till today and continues to do it. And she's recording the stories of the photos that would be packed up and shipped off, suggesting that she was adding orality to the ways in which archives can, and as scholar Diana Taylor puts it, be effective and part of a repertoire, or repeated narrations constituting living history and memory. Prior to the estate sale and through a network that includes a fair number of people in this symposium, spearheaded by Sojin Kim, helped along with Michelle, curators from the Smithsonian, the Natural History Museum of LA County, the Japanese American National Museum, and the Huntington Library came through. And they collectively went through the materials. And so over this course of time, Susie donated key artifacts to them. And in each case, the items join other relevant collections. So for instance, though we can hardly call the Huntington a community-based collection, the business records and photos of Tokio Florist do reside there, along with the records of other Japanese American flower farms and shops, like their neighbors and friends, the Kuromis, Flower View Gardens. Taken together, these family records offer opportunities for counter-narratives and remappings. The labor of working people, exploited people, and marginalized people is persistently erased in the public realm. Too often, when the focus is on such labor, joy is rare. Love, family, community, again, rarely part of the depiction. Yet these images that we see here together offer forceful counter-narratives beyond being a collective family album. They also remap landscapes of labor to reflect this power. So in addition to Susie's efforts to capture the essence of her family's longtime residence and business, we have a lot of words from a lot of neighbors. I want to mention just one, Ernest and Elaine Nagamatsu, residents of Silver Lake nearby since 1975. They named the significance of the Sagai Kazawa property in Tokio Florist as more than a mere physical site. To them, it's an emotional, historical talisman for the generations. Tokio Florist made us all so proud as Japanese Americans. It has been a small beam of success following the tangled, tortuous emotional challenge following World War II. From physical and monetary huge losses, Tokio Florist and legions of JA gardeners and flower growers emerged from a devastated landscape of broken dreams to make us all proud once again. I want to close with this image to enable us to imagine other ways to mobilize a history that represents this critical cartographies in our title, in which the JA experience expressed in the Tokio Florist story intersects with other groups of people at multiple sites, allowing us to read something new into those spatial and social relationships. How might we go beyond the ethnically specific elements of some of the national thematic context statement studies and multi-property nominations so that we develop more intersectional analyses to gesture towards possibilities for new interpretations, rather than pretending that once a nomination or an archive is all sorted out, the knowledge is static and in place? What might we gain from future possible interpretations that derive from all the various forms of documentation, commemoration, and that continuum of preservation related to Tokio Florist? My colleagues Lisa Park and Stevie Ruiz chose this image for a multi-platform project called Climates of Inequality. They highlight this as an example of intersectionality for sure, but also to highlight labor, racial capitalism, and the logics of dispossession and settler colonialism that we must also consider if we're to address critical elements of climate change and environmental justice. They issued a reminder of the interconnectedness of all these elements of power. Sorry. In doing so, they suggest the ways, the various preservation strategies that Susie and multiple communities involved in this case study open up in terms of more directions going forward, perhaps speculative right now in terms of what new information we might discover with historic resources preserved, to advance new narratives and counter narratives in productive ways that reckon with the past, but do so with an eye towards both repair and reparation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will move into Q&A session, and we have some questions already. Since this is from the previous presentation, I'll go ahead and ask it. So someone is wondering if the Tokio Florist is gone or if it is now just a craftsman style house used for private residence, and if it is on the National Register.
So it has the local designation. As far as we know, all the structures that we mentioned that are threatened are still extant, but this remains an ongoing project, and it's not currently on the National Register. Tokio Florist as a business closed in 2006, but the family, the Kozawa family, remained the owner until 2019, I believe.
Sumi was there until 2016, and then Susie remained until 2019. We're keeping an eye on it, but we haven't heard back from the owners in quite a while.
And that probably feeds into this next question. Let's see. I am wondering if you had encountered any resistance from the communities whose heritage you were trying to preserve. Very common in Asian American Pacific Islander communities. Let's see, for example, the local landmark nomination might have conflicts with the owner's economic interests. And as landmark nominations don't always require the owner's approval, would you suggest going against the owner's wills to preserve the buildings or something else? Thank you very much in advance for your thoughts.
Yeah, I think in this case, the Little Tokyo Historical Society was the applicant, and we received a lot of support from the Japanese American community. Kathy mentioned one of the comments that we received in a letter of support. The owner, unofficially was supportive. This is the family was, unofficially, Susie was supportive of our efforts to preserve the family's history and, the memory of Tokio Florist. In my own experience, I've had some pushback from the owner who, was from the Asian American community, and we just proceeded with nominating that building and site. This is a different example from Tokio Florist, but we felt that the story was really important to preserve and document. So I think it is really important to continue to provide education, to the community about some of the benefits of historic preservation, as a way to document our history and to make it more accessible to a broader audience.
Financial implications are really huge. I think that we were very worried that the possibility of the benefit added to the property related to Japanese American heritage might lead to a kind of cultural capitalization or, thematizing of it rather than being authentically related to the family and laboring landscapes. So that was a whole other set of concerns after the nomination. But the concerns about the family was that, this had to be sold as part of the estate. And so there were family members who might not have agreed with the designation, but the community, which is multiracial around the property, was very much opposed to further development. So a lot of things aligned in this particular case, as we were lucky enough to find out.
So Hannah, I'd also offer a quick response to that. First, a clarification that for National Historic Landmark nomination, you do need the owner's consent. For National Register, you don't, if I understand that correctly, but for landmarks, you certainly do. And in the case of Guadalupe Mission Chapel, because the preservation, and interpretation efforts we're 8+ years now, we've undergone changes in leadership. So the bishop of San Jose in 2012 was very supportive, and there's a new bishop now. And the pastor was very supportive, and there's a new pastor now. So the efforts that are continuing, I think Michelle might have mentioned this earlier today, the possibility of National Historical Park legislation, which was introduced in the last Congress and should be introduced again in this Congress. There's reluctance and there's questions from the current bishop and the current pastor. And so the parish itself is I wouldn't say divided, but not as enthusiastic as they were in 2012, 13, 14, and so.
Thank you. And Dr. Wiley, do you have anything to add regarding this question?
Not to that question, no.
Okay, cool. Let's see, we have another question for Dr. Wiley asking if the revised National Register form is available somewhere for review.
So one of the reasons why I present this work is because it's one of the projects that I've worked on most recently, but also because I'm in the process of battling for kind of representation in the court of public opinion. So the revised National Historic Landmark form has not been reviewed by the National Historic Landmark Committee yet. You might know, or you might not know, that over the course of the last administration, the National Historic Landmark Committee did not meet in an official capacity for 3 years. So they've got to back up. So no one has seen the particular revised version of the Carter G. Woodson nomination that we've put forward to the National Park Service. They do have it. So right now what we're doing is waiting to see which meeting they will be looking at this nomination. If it's the fall 2021, if it's spring 2022. So National Historic Landmark nomination updates need to go through a similar process as those that have been nominated for the first time. And that is, the committee has to look at it and agree that the arguments that are put forward make sense, that the changes make sense. We were very much anxious about what the new National Historic Landmark Committee would look like in terms of demographics, in terms of interest and concerns. We were particularly concerned in the last administration, which I think is one of the reasons why we got a lot of pushback in the first place, right? If you try to say that this is an American ideal, will the committee accept it given current political tensions? So that's the long way of saying it is not released yet. It's in draft form. It will become public property, so to speak, once it gets by the National Historic Landmark Committee.
Thank you. This is a question for Dr. Hayashi and Dr. Gudis. What projects are you all going to do around the archives beyond the use of the physical site here as it relates to heritage conservation?
One real bummer about the stalled conversations is that we were discussing the fact that certain structures that were ephemeral in the front of the property that acted as carports would need to come. It was kind of a negotiation, right? That those might need to come down, but that they could be reconstructed in more permanent materials closer to the sidewalk. So there'd be a way for the public to interact with the site, and that the materials from that carport could be used by artists to create an installation. And of course, my dreamscape was, to have, sound as part of that installation so that it could serve as a way for people to come in, get a cup of coffee, have a quasi public space to experience the site. Now, with everything stalled and with the archive now in part at various museums in the face of COVID, things have not been proceeding in terms of trying to come up with other kinds of plans. But I'll let Kristen maybe chime in on other ideas she's had, and I'm sure that we're all open to more.
I think in addition to ideas that we've had for public art installations on the site, you know, I work at the Japanese American National Museum, and I'm in the beginning stages of an exhibition highlighting the stories and experiences of women. And I would just love to feature Yuki and Sumi in an exhibition. So using the collection that we received from the family and possibly, you know, collaborating with these other institutions that have components of the family's collection, I think it would make for a really great addition to an exhibition.
Great, that's really exciting. I'm hoping that the exhibition is available online somewhere. And for Dr. Rast, kind of going back to the congregation, what do they see as the downside to a National Historic Landmark nomination?
I'm not, so I have to go back a few years, right? So the effort to nominate the building for NHL designation started in 2012, and then it concluded in 2016. So it is a National Historic Landmark now. Back then, some of the initial concerns or questions were about the implications. You know, does NHL designation mean the federal government's going to acquire the property, right? So we had to reassure some folks about what the designation means, the benefits and maybe the drawbacks, such as they are. The concerns I'd really be, you know, I think about now are with the potential for inclusion of the property in a National Historical Park. And really that boils down to tourism and the pressures of people knowing about the site, which would be wonderful, and learning about the story it has to tell. But it's a parish that's bursting at the seams. The campus, you know, the parish campus is the same size as it was. It actually expanded in the 70s when they moved the building and constructed a new church, but it hasn't grown since. But the community itself has. So quite a lot of population density. And if that means, you know, school buses or charter buses or whatever, those are the kinds of concerns they have. Like there's support for the National Historical Park, you know, legislation and inclusion, but a lot of planning and thought needs to go into how the pressures that would come with that could be mitigated, perhaps through the use of surrounding property, some of which is city property, for potentially like an off-site interpreter center or something like that. So just those day-to-day concerns about the impact.
Great, thank you. And another question for Dr. Wiley. Could you outline some of your research methods when finding more information and revising the Woodson House nomination form?
Yes, indeed. Before I do that, though, I did want to give another shout out to Ray, because he might not know that the argument that he put forward about the integrity and the reversibility of materials is one that I used later for a local nomination, the Berry Farms Public Housing nomination in Washington, D.C. I used the same integrity argument about reversibility in Secretary of Interior standards. And I only really knew to do that from seeing the case study of Our Lady of Guadalupe when I was on the National Historic Landmark Committee. So that, like, we're learning from each other. And once we figure out these, those methods.
We need to compare notes. Yeah.
Like this is where it happens. So in terms of research methods, obviously I started with the original nomination, saw who prepared the nomination, learned more about the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation and what they were doing in the 1970s. So understanding the kinds of arguments that they were trying to make in the 70s to help me understand the importance even of the process of the nomination. Like, it was really meta. In terms of beefing up the argument, we used a lot of secondary source material and primary source material. So we used Carter G. Woodson's words whenever we could. We looked at the Journal of Negro History. We looked at the Negro History Bulletin in moments where he was talking specifically about this movement that he was creating, or this, you know, it was anti-racism before anti-racism, right? Like this is what it is. So We looked at all that primary source materials. I went to the Library of Congress and actually went into Carter G. Woodson's files there, because we even had small hiccups, like when did he actually purchase the site? When did he, the deed transfer? Like I was looking at all this stuff. So, I mean, to the nitty gritty, the arguments about his significance in particular as it related to Criterion 3 was validated through the words of his mentees, the historians who came after him when they were speaking about his influence, right? A politician speaking about his influence, like Eleanor Holmes Norton. So it was, I mean, it was a lot of work and a lot of different levels of research, from the ways that even his significance is clear today, from Negro History Week to Black History Month to the different, Asian American Pacific Islander Women's History Month, like all of these things coming afterwards, right? So that was really like, it was very rigorous, and looks at his significance, his history, his life, the history of the neighborhood, his connection to other movers and shakers in DC, like Mary McLeod Bethune, like all of these things coming together. So hopefully that answers the question. That's just a little sneak peek in the work we were doing.
Thank you. It's fascinating to hear about the original arguments and kind of pulling that history forward to today. Let's see, that was our last question. Does anyone else want to add anything to the last question, or if there are more, please feel free to add them to the Q&A.
I just want to do a little quick shout out to each of the presenters in this session. As Amber just mentioned, she served on the National Parks, NHL committee, which is a huge honor to be asked, because not many people get asked, but it's also a testament of like her expertise in knowing Criterion, which, standards and stuff, like it's not fun to like try to not only understand it and become expert, but like understand interpretation and its flaws. And then also that, similar note, Ray has done amazing work. If you read the Cesar Chavez Special Resource Study, I think I have a hard copy back here next to the API theme study, like these publications are huge, and that it's an honor to have folks who look like us, not only being, I mentioned earlier today, we're asked to serve in these honorific task force, which, sometimes we laugh because it's like not because of the color of our skin or our gender. It's really good, like we need to, I want to acknowledge just like the brilliance of everyone on this panel, including Kathy, who is an amazing professor at UC Riverside, and she's a wonderful community convener and mentor to students, including Kristen, who is a student of hers, who became familiar with historic preservation through a practicum class, right? Which then led to, as she had mentioned, Japanese hospital. She was exploring that, and then it then became this whole process. Now it's not only locally designated, but it's on the state register. It's deemed eligible. We can totally dissect that one later on the National Register because of owner opposition. And I actually tell my students and my friends who are often like, how do I write these things? I refer to these scholars. They write beautifully, and not just write beautifully, but brilliantly, because they spend so much time really trying to not only understand these standards, and that's why this session was called Disrupting the Standards, right? I've sat through online sessions where we're talking about race and equity and justice, and the chat just goes off about the standards, but I'm like, there are folks who devote their whole life to really, I don't want to say attacking, but really trying to understand why these standards were created, how they impact us in the work we do. So I just want to say thank you to this session. And, I know it's the last session, so people are just like maybe falling like hangry mode at this point. So I thank all of you for the presenters and Hannah for being part of this session. And so yes, thank you to Kathy, Amber, Ray, Kristen, and Hannah for this wonderful session.